Princess Anne had completed 474 official engagements, more than King Charles, more than Prince William, more than any other member of the royal family. She'd done it during a year when the king and Catherine were receiving cancer treatment. She'd done it after a horse-related accident left her with a concussion and put her in hospital. And she'd done it at 74 years old. There was no national ceremony, no grand speech, no moment when the country stopped and acknowledged who had carried the greatest workload. Anne simply finished the year the same way she'd spent it, working. And this wasn't one exceptional year. It was the latest chapter in a pattern stretching back more than half a century. You've seen Princess Anne all your life, usually at the edge of the photograph, standing behind the headline makers, wearing a uniform, shaking a hand, opening a hospital, visiting a charity, or stepping quietly into another room where duty had called. She was always there, but the full story of what she gave, and what giving it cost her, has rarely been told in one piece. The spotlight moved to Diana, then Catherine, then Meghan. Anne kept working in the background. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to follow more than 5 decades of courage, sacrifice, family pain, and service that no other living royal can match. And by the end, you'll understand why the woman who gave so much to the crown was the one it never seemed to know how to thank. If you believe stories like Anne's deserve to be told properly, take a second to like the video and subscribe to Behind the Crown. Now let's go back to where her story really began. Princess Anne entered the world at Clarence House on August 15, 1950, the second child of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Charles wasn't quite 2. At birth, Anne stood third in line to the throne, behind her mother and her brother. For a brief period, she moved even closer. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, Anne became second in line, directly behind Charles. But her position came with a condition she couldn't control. Under the succession rules then in force, an older daughter ranked behind any younger son. Anne's age, ability, and place within the family wouldn't matter. The birth of a brother would move her down automatically. That hadn't happened yet, but the rule was already waiting for her. Her childhood unfolded inside a family being pulled rapidly into public duty. After Elizabeth became queen, official tours could take both parents away for months. Nannies handled much of the daily routine, while Anne learned one of the monarchy's earliest lessons. When the crown called, family life adjusted around it. At 13, she left palace schooling and entered Benenden School in Kent as a boarder. She was among the first British princesses to complete her education in a regular school setting. There were timetables, exams, shared routines, and classmates who knew her not as a future monarch, but simply as Anne. The resemblance to Prince Philip soon became difficult to miss. He was direct, practical, fiercely competitive, and impatient with fuss. Anne developed those same sharp edges. She rode hard, spoke plainly, and never learned to soften herself simply to make other people comfortable. When school ended, she didn't go to university. At 18, she stepped straight into royal work. Her first official engagement came in 1969 when she opened an educational and training center in Shropshire. It wasn't a glittering state occasion, it was practical work, the kind that would later define her life. Arrive prepared, meet the people doing the job, finish the duty, move on. But just as Anne's public life was beginning, the old rule hanging over her childhood was about to become personal. On February 19, 1960, the Queen gave birth to her third child, Prince Andrew. For most families, the arrival of a baby brother wouldn't alter the value of the sister already waiting at home. For Anne, it changed her constitutional position overnight. She'd spent nearly 8 years as second in line to the throne, directly behind Charles. Then Andrew was born, and although Anne was 9 years older, he moved ahead of her immediately. Not because he'd done anything, not because anyone believed he was better prepared, simply because he was a boy. 4 years later, the same thing happened again. Prince Edward arrived in March 1964. Anne was 13 by then, old enough to understand exactly what the birth announcement meant. Her new baby brother was placed above her too. The order now ran Charles, Andrew, Edward, then Anne. 3 brothers, then the daughter. That wasn't a private family preference. It was the law. Britain followed male preference primogeniture, a system in which sons were placed ahead of their older sisters. A daughter could remain near the throne only until another boy was born. The moment he arrived, she moved aside. Anne never lost her royal title. She lost something quieter, the place that birth orders should have given her. And there was no appeal, no decision to challenge, no question about whether the older child might be more capable, more disciplined, or better suited to public life. The rule had already answered. Male came first. What makes Anne's story so striking isn't simply that this happened. It's that Britain eventually admitted the system was wrong. In 2013, Parliament passed the Succession to the Crown Act. The new law ended the rule that allowed a younger son to push an older daughter down the line, but it came with a cutoff date. Change applied only to people born after October 28, 2011. That date protected the next generation. When Princess Charlotte's younger brother Louis was born in 2018, he didn't move ahead of her. Charlotte kept her position because, for the first time, her sex counted for nothing in deciding which sibling came first. That was progress. But it wasn't retroactive. The law corrected the system without correcting what the system had already done to Anne. So today, the official line places Charlotte 3rd and Louis 4th. Andrew remains 8th. Edward is 15th. Edward's son James is 16th. His daughter Louise is 17th. Anne is 18th. The Queen's second child still stands behind both younger brothers and all their children. The law that once moved her aside has been abolished for those who came after her. Its effect on her remains untouched. Now Anne has never turned that fact into a public campaign. She hasn't spent decades demanding that Parliament rewrite the order for her benefit. She hasn't made her position a grievance in interviews. She hasn't asked the public to treat her as a victim. That wouldn't be her way. But silence doesn't make the fact less revealing. Anne grew up inside a system that separated rank from effort. She could work harder than the men above her. She could know more. She could show greater discipline. None of it would move her up by a single place. The succession didn't reward service. It followed bloodline, birth order, and, during Anne's childhood, sex. That left her with a choice. She could spend her life staring at the door that had been closed, or she could find another measure of worth. Anne chose usefulness. It sounds like a modest word, almost dull, but inside the royal family, usefulness means showing up when there's no glamour attached. It means taking the hospital opening in a town the national press won't visit. It means meeting volunteers whose names won't appear in tomorrow's newspaper. It means learning the work well enough that the people doing it can tell whether you've come prepared. A throne can only belong to one person. Work has no such limit, and Anne understood that early. There was another place where rank offered no protection: on horseback. A horse didn't care where she stood in the succession. It didn't care who her mother was. It responded to balance, nerve, judgment, and hours of training. Anne couldn't command respect from an animal with a title. She had to earn it. That suited her. Royal life was built around deference. Riding gave her consequences. Make a mistake, and the ground came up fast. Lose focus, and the course exposed it. There were no courtiers who could change the result afterward. It gave Anne something the palace couldn't: a fair test. And as she moved out of school and into public life, the two sides of her character began to come together. The competitor wanted standards. The princess had obligations. Anne found a way to bring both into the same room. In 1970, the year she turned 20, she became president of Save the Children. This wasn't an honorary role she accepted late in life after her reputation had already been built. She took it on at the beginning of adulthood, before the public knew what kind of working royal she'd become. Save the Children dealt with hunger, displacement, disease, poverty, and war. There were no easy visits, no simple answers, and no reason to believe a young princess would stay once the novelty wore off. Anne stayed. She served as the charities president from 1970 until 2017, then succeeded the Queen as its patron. What began when she was barely out of school became an association lasting more than half a century. That choice tells us something important. When the institution limited Anne's place within the family, she began building a life beyond its internal ranking. She couldn't change who stood ahead of her, but she could decide what she stood for. And while succession placed her behind her brothers, the working world was beginning to reveal something the law couldn't measure. Anne could take pressure. She could remain focused when a room turned difficult. She could hold her ground when someone expected her to step aside. Those qualities would become clear in charity meetings, overseas visits, and years of public duty. But the first real test wouldn't happen inside a palace or across a conference table. It would happen on a dark road near Buckingham Palace. There would be a blocked car, a gunman, 4 wounded men, and a command for Anne to leave the vehicle. Her answer would become the most famous sentence she ever spoke. At around 8 o'clock on the evening of March 20th, 1974, Princess Anne was traveling back toward Buckingham Palace. She was 23 and had been married to Captain Mark Phillips for just 4 months. They attended a charity film screening and were returning in a maroon royal car. Anne and Mark sat in the back with her lady-in-waiting. Her protection officer, Inspector James Beaton, was in the front beside the chauffeur, Alexander Callender. The palace was only a few hundred yards away. Then a white Ford Escort shot past them. It swerved across the road and stopped directly in front of the royal car. Callender had no room to avoid it. He braked. A man stepped out. His name was Ian Ball. He was carrying 2 handguns. At first, Inspector Beaton appears to have thought they were dealing with an angry motorist. He got out to see what had happened. Ball raised a weapon and fired. The bullet struck Beaton in the shoulder. Even wounded, Beaton drew his own pistol and tried to return fire. He missed. When he attempted a second shot, the gun jammed. Ball moved toward the back door. Anne was sitting on the other side. He pulled at the handle and ordered her to open it. Inside, Anne and Mark held the door shut. Her lady-in-waiting escaped through the opposite side, giving Beaton a chance to climb into the rear of the car. Bleeding from the shoulder, he placed himself between the gunman and the princess. Ball fired into the vehicle. Beaton lifted his hand toward the window, taking the bullet and flying glass. Then Ball shot him again, this time in the abdomen. 3 bullets had hit the officer. He collapsed onto the road. The chauffeur, Alexander Callender, got out and confronted Ball. Ball shot him in the chest. Now there was no armed protection officer standing between the gunman and Anne. Ball pulled open the rear door and grabbed her arm. Mark Phillips locked his hands around his wife's waist. For several seconds, Princess Anne became the center of a physical struggle. The gunman pulled from outside, her husband pulled from within. Anne's dress tore down the back. Ball told her she had to come with him. Anne refused. Years later, she described what followed as a very irritating conversation. That description is almost absurdly restrained. A man carrying guns had shot her bodyguard and chauffeur. He had hold of her arm. He was trying to drag her from a car. Anne argued with him. She later recalled that she kept telling Ball she didn't want to get out and wasn't going to get out. Then came the line remembered ever since. Not bloody likely. It wasn't delivered from behind palace gates. There were no soldiers surrounding her, no rehearsed speech, no safe distance between Anne and the threat. The man holding her had already fired repeatedly. She still said no. The struggle was far from over. Police Constable Michael Hills heard the disturbance and approached, initially believing there had been a traffic accident. Ball turned and shot him in the stomach. Before collapsing, Hills managed to radio for help. A journalist named Brian McConnell also came toward the car. He recognized the royal insignia and understood that someone inside was in danger. McConnell tried to reason with the gunman. Ball shot him too. Within minutes, 4 men had been hit. Beaton, Callender, Hills, McConnell. All of them were bleeding on or beside the mall, and Anne was still inside the car. Then Ronald Russell entered the scene. Russell was driving home when he noticed the wounded policeman. He parked, approached on foot, and saw Ball return his attention to the princess. Russell stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and had boxed as a heavyweight. He came up behind Ball and struck him in the back of the head. For a moment, the gunman's focus broke. Anne moved toward the door on the other side of the car. This wasn't a simple escape. She later explained that she thought getting out might draw Ball away from the wounded men and shift his position. It worked. Ball ran around the car toward her. Anne immediately climbed back inside and slammed the door. Russell hit Ball again. More police were arriving now, and Anne saw the gunman beginning to lose control of the situation. She reportedly told him, "Go on, now's your chance." Ball ran. A detective constable named Peter Edmonds pursued him into St. James's Park, tackled him, and made the arrest. The attack was over. Only afterward did the full plan become clear. Inside Ball's Ford Escort, police found 2 pairs of handcuffs, Valium tranquilizers, and a ransom letter addressed to Queen Elizabeth. Ball demanded £2 million in £5 notes. He wanted the money packed into 20 unlocked suitcases and placed aboard an aircraft bound for Switzerland. The letter also called for the Queen herself to appear as part of the handover. This hadn't been a sudden roadside outburst. Ball had arrived prepared to remove Anne, restrain her, drug her, and use her life as leverage against her mother. The official response recognized the people who had stopped him. Inspector Beaton received the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry. Michael Hills and Ronald Russell received the George Medal. Alexander Callender, Peter Edmonds, and Brian McConnell received the Queen's Gallantry Medal. Another chauffeur, Glenmore Martin, who helped block Ball's escape and assisted the wounded, received a Queen's Commendation for brave conduct. The awards mattered because Anne hadn't survived alone. Men placed themselves between her and bullets. A journalist walked toward a gun. A passing driver stopped instead of continuing home. A wounded constable called for help before thinking of himself. And a protection officer kept shielding Anne after his own weapon failed and his body had already been hit. But Anne's part mattered too. She didn't freeze. She didn't obey. She watched what was happening, argued with Ball, shifted his attention, and made decisions while people around her were being shot. Courage doesn't always look like charging forward. Sometimes it looks like refusing to move. The story filled newspapers. Then public life carried on. Anne didn't turn the attack into the center of her identity. She didn't build a public image around surviving it. Once statements had been given and the wounded had been visited, she returned to the life she'd already chosen. And that life included a second arena where nobody could protect her with protocol. Competitive eventing. By the night Ian Ball stopped her car, Anne was already one of Britain's most accomplished riders. In 1971, at 21, she won individual gold at the European Eventing Championships riding Doublet, a horse bred by the Queen. That same year, the British public voted her BBC Sports Personality of the Year. This wasn't a royal honor arranged through family connections. It was a national sporting award earned against professional competition. In 1975, Anne added 2 more major results: silver in both the individual and team events at the European Championships. Then came Montreal. In 1976, Anne became the first member of the British royal family to compete in the Olympic Games. She entered the equestrian 3-day event as part of the British team, riding Goodwill, another horse owned by her mother. There was a joke Anne reportedly enjoyed about the arrangement. The Queen had bred both the horse and the rider, but royal blood offered no advantage once the course began. Eventing asks a rider to perform across dressage, cross-country, and show jumping. It tests control, stamina, judgment, and nerve. One poor approach can end the competition. One refusal can destroy the score. One fall can do much worse. The Montreal cross-country course had been made dangerous by rain and mud. Goodwill came into a jump and went down. Anne was thrown. She suffered a concussion, and then she got back on. Years later, Anne pushed back slightly against the heroic version of that moment. She joked that she hadn't simply remounted through pure willpower. People had helped put her back on the horse. But that only makes what followed more unsettling. She continued riding. She completed the remaining fences. And afterward, she couldn't remember doing it. "I don't remember anything at all after the fall," she said. The body was still competing. The trained instincts were still working. But the memory had gone dark. There's something revealing in the way Anne handled both events. On the Mall, she refused to be pulled from a car. In Montreal, she returned to the saddle after being thrown from it. But she didn't spend the years afterward asking either moment to define her. The kidnapping became a remarkable story people occasionally retold. The Olympics became a line in royal biographies. Anne kept moving. That may be why the scale of both achievements faded so easily. She didn't explain to the public how brave she'd been. She didn't package her pain. She didn't give the press an emotional performance to replay. She treated survival as something that had happened, not something she was owed attention for. and the palace was comfortable with that. A royal who carried on without asking questions made life easier for everyone. But the next test couldn't be settled by refusing a gunman or holding on to a horse. It would arrive slowly, inside her marriage, away from cheering crowds, and this time carrying on would demand something harder than physical courage. It would demand silence while her private life came apart. On November 14th, 1973, Princess Anne walked into Westminster Abbey beside Captain Mark Phillips. The ceremony had everything expected of a royal wedding. Crowds filled the streets. More than 1,000 guests watched inside the Abbey. Millions followed on television. Anne was 23. Mark was 25. Both were elite riders. Both understood horses, competition, early mornings, hard falls, and the discipline required to get back up. From the outside, the match made sense. But a wedding watched around the world still becomes a marriage lived behind closed doors. And over time, theirs began to come apart. There isn't a neat version of what happened. This wasn't a simple story with one innocent person and one clear villain. By the end of the 1980s, Anne and Mark were spending long periods apart, and both were being linked publicly to other people. Then a private fact from Mark's life became impossible to hide. In 1985, while he was still married to Anne, Mark fathered a daughter in New Zealand with art teacher Heather Tonkin. The child, Felicity, was born that August. In 1991, a DNA test conducted during a paternity case confirmed that Mark was her father. Stop there for a moment. Anne's husband had fathered a child with another woman. The child was born while Anne was raising Peter and Zara at Gatcombe Park and continuing her public duties. Yet Anne didn't take her pain to television. She didn't sit down with a journalist and describe the humiliation. She didn't ask the public to choose a side. That doesn't mean she felt nothing. It means she kept whatever she felt inside a very small circle. By the time the paternity result became known, the marriage was already effectively over. Buckingham Palace had announced Anne and Mark's separation on August 31st, 1989. The statement was dry, controlled, and almost aggressively calm. They had decided to separate on terms agreed between them, and at that point, the palace said there were no plans for divorce. For nearly 3 years, that arrangement held. Anne remained at Gatcombe Park. Mark moved into another property nearby. They continued sharing responsibility for their children. Then, in April 1992, Anne filed for divorce. It was finalized 10 days later, on April 23rd. She became the first of Queen Elizabeth II's children to end a marriage legally. The timing made it part of one of the most damaging years the modern monarchy had faced. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson announced their separation in March. Anne's divorce followed in April. Windsor Castle burned in November. Charles and Diana announced their separation in December. It was the year the Queen would call her Annus Horribilis. Yet Anne's divorce occupied a strange place within that chaos. It was historically significant, but it didn't become a long public drama. There was no emotional interview to study frame by frame, no public battle over who had suffered more, no attempt to turn the end of a marriage into a second career. The legal process was completed, Anne carried on. But long before the divorce papers were signed, she'd already made one of the most revealing decisions of her life. It concerned her children. Peter Phillips was born on November 15th, 1977. He was the Queen's first grandchild. Zara followed on May 15th, 1981. Neither child was born a prince or princess. Royal titles usually passed through the male line. Because Anne was the daughter of the monarch rather than a son, Peter and Zara weren't automatically entitled to royal status. That could have been changed. When Anne married Mark, he was reportedly offered a peerage, as men marrying senior royal women had often received before him. An earldom would have given their children courtesy titles. Anne and Mark declined. So the Queen's first grandchild entered the official announcement not as a prince, an earl, or a lord. He was simply Peter Phillips. 4 years later, his sister was simply Zara Phillips. At the time, it may have looked like a small break with custom. It wasn't. Anne had grown up knowing that a royal title could decide where someone stood before that person had spoken a word. She knew what it was like to have identity tied to rank, ceremony, and rules written before birth. And when the choice reached her own children, she left those layers off. Peter and Zara still belonged to the royal family. They attended major family occasions and remained in the line of succession. But they weren't working royals. There was no His Royal Highness or Her Royal Highness before their names. There was no expectation that adulthood would mean opening buildings, representing the monarch, or surrendering a private career to public duty. They were allowed to build lives outside the palace structure. That didn't mean their childhood was ordinary in every sense. They grew up at Gatcombe Park. Their grandmother was the queen. They attended private schools, including Gordonston, and moved inside circles most children would never enter. Anne wasn't pretending they were anonymous. She was giving them distance. There's a difference. Years later, when Vanity Fair asked Anne about the decision, she said it had probably made life easier for them. Most people, she added, would accept that titles came with disadvantages. So I think that was probably the right thing to do. That was Anne's version of reflection. No grand claim that she'd broken a cycle. No speech about modernizing the monarchy. Just a practical judgment made by a mother who understood the system from the inside. Peter went into business and sports management rather than royal service. Zara became a professional equestrian, and she wasn't treated as an athlete because a palace announcement called her one. She had to qualify. She had to find sponsorship. She had to compete against riders who weren't required to bow to her. In 2006, Zara became the individual eventing world champion. In 2012, she won Olympic team silver in London. The medal gave her something a courtesy title never could, a distinction she'd earned herself. In 2023, Zara spoke about the choice Anne had made decades earlier. She said she and Peter had been lucky not to receive titles because it allowed them to do things in their own way. Then she thanked her mother for it. From my point of view, I was obviously very lucky that my mother didn't give us any titles, so I really commend her on that. It's one of the clearest public expressions of gratitude Anne has received, and it came from the person who had lived with the result. Peter and Zara became the only two of Elizabeth II's 8 grandchildren to have no title at all. William and Harry were princes from birth. Beatrice and Eugenie were princesses. Edward's children weren't publicly styled as prince and princess, but they still carried courtesy titles connected to their father's peerage. Peter and Zara had none, just their names. Anne hadn't rejected her family. She hadn't rejected the monarchy. She continued serving both. But when she was given control over one part of her children's future, she didn't pull them closer to the machine. She gave them room to stand beyond it. That decision becomes even more striking when we look at what Anne did next. Her first marriage ended publicly in April 1992. 8 months later, she married again. The man was Commander Timothy Lawrence, a Royal Navy officer who had served as an equerry to the Queen. Their relationship hadn't escaped controversy. In 1989, private letters Lawrence had written to Anne were stolen and given to a newspaper. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the letters were genuine, but called them personal. Anne didn't release the contents. She didn't try to explain the relationship in public. She kept moving toward the life she'd chosen. On December 12, 1992, Anne and Timothy Lawrence married at Crathy Kirk, near Balmoral. There were around 30 guests. No Westminster Abbey, no packed grandstands, no vast television audience waiting to see the dress. The bride wore a simple white jacket over a knee-length dress. White flowers were placed in her hair. The ceremony was so small that it stood almost opposite to her first wedding in every possible way. Scotland wasn't chosen only for privacy. At that time, the Church of England generally didn't permit a divorced person to remarry in church while a former spouse was still alive. The Church of Scotland could allow it. So the Queen's daughter crossed the border to marry in a church where her divorce didn't close the door. There's a quiet irony in that. Anne had spent her life serving an institution built around tradition, but when she needed a second chance, tradition couldn't fully accommodate her. She found another way. The marriage has now lasted for more than 33 years. Timothy Lawrence hasn't tried to become the center of Anne's public story. He appears beside her when the moment calls for it, supports her work, and then steps back. Their relationship isn't sold as a royal romance. It doesn't need to be. Among the 4 children of Queen Elizabeth II, theirs is now the longest-running current marriage. The wedding with almost no spectacle produced the partnership that lasted. And perhaps that was Anne's answer to everything the first marriage had taught her. Privacy wasn't emptiness. Silence wasn't failure. A life didn't become more real because millions of people were invited to watch it. She'd protected her children from titles. She'd allowed a broken marriage to end without turning it into public theater. She'd remarried on terms that suited the life she actually wanted. But here's what makes those years difficult to take in. While all of this was happening, while Anne was raising two children, managing a separation, going through a divorce, and rebuilding her private life, she never stepped away from the causes she'd accepted as a young woman. The private strain didn't replace the public work, it ran beside it. And far from palace ceremonies, Anne was building a record so large that even many people who recognize her face still don't know its scale. More than 300. That's the number of charities, organizations, and military bodies connected to Princess Anne's public life. Not 300 appearances, more than 300 continuing relationships. Some are ceremonial, others have lasted for decades. Several exist because Anne helped create them in the first place. That number can become meaningless if we move past it too quickly. 300 organizations means 300 sets of people expecting her to understand why their work matters. It means briefings, visits, speeches, boardrooms, hospitals, farms, universities, military units, community centers, research projects, and volunteers who know immediately whether a visitor has read the notes. Anne's value has never been that she can arrive, smile, and leave. It's that she often returns. Save the Children is the clearest example. She became its president in 1970, when she was 20. She remained president until 2017, when she succeeded Queen Elizabeth II as the charity's patron. That's more than half a century tied to one organization. But time alone doesn't explain the relationship. Anne went where the organization worked. She visited projects in Bangladesh, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Uganda, China, Cambodia, Botswana, Madagascar, and the Philippines. These weren't all comfortable capital city receptions. The work took her into communities dealing with hunger, displacement, disease, weak health systems, and the long damage left by conflict. She didn't begin by assuming that being royal made her an expert. In 2020, Anne said it had taken her about 10 years before she felt confident enough to contribute properly to Save the Children's public discussions. Why so long? Because she believed she first needed to understand how the work operated on the ground. Her early overseas visits weren't simply opportunities to be photographed beside a project. They were part of her education. That may be the sharpest difference between Anne's method and the kind of royal charity work designed for instant attention. She didn't arrive with a personal theory that the organization was expected to follow. She listened until she understood where she could be useful. 10 years is a long time to listen before deciding you've earned the right to speak. For Anne, it was preparation. By 1990, the depth of that work had been noticed far beyond Britain. Kenneth Kaunda, then president of Zambia, nominated her for the Nobel Peace Prize because of her work with Save the Children over the previous 2 decades. Anne didn't win, but the nomination matters. A head of state looked at what a British princess had been doing across developing countries and decided it belonged in the same conversation as the world's most serious peace and humanitarian efforts. And still, the nomination never became the central story attached to her name. The public knew the blunt remarks, the horses, the severe expression photographers loved catching at the wrong second. Far fewer knew that a foreign president had put her forward for a Nobel Prize. 1 year later, Anne helped turn her attention toward a group much closer to home: unpaid carers. In 1991, the Princess Royal Trust for Carers was founded on her initiative. At the time, people who cared for sick, elderly, or disabled family members were only beginning to be recognized as a group with needs of their own. There was limited organized support, little respite, and no broad public language for the exhaustion that could come from providing care every day without pay. The trust helped build a network of local carers centers offering information, practical help, and support. In 2012, it merged with Crossroads Care to form Carers Trust, which now works through a large network of local organizations across Britain. That's what Anne's work often looks like. She sees the people hidden inside a larger problem. Not only the patient, but the relative keeping the household together. Not only the hospital, but the transport system preventing someone from reaching it. Not only the public campaign, but the local worker who has to continue after the cameras leave. That same practical thinking can be seen in two other organizations she helped develop, TransAid and Riders for Health. Both focused on transport problems in developing countries. A clinic can exist, medicine can be available, a trained health worker can be ready. But none of that helps a remote community if the roads are poor, the vehicles fail, or there's no reliable way to move supplies and patients. It's not glamorous work. It's the part that determines whether the glamorous promise works at all. Anne's official record also crossed political borders that other royals hadn't yet entered. In 1990, she became the first member of the British royal family to make an official visit to the Soviet Union. This was still the USSR. The Berlin Wall had fallen only months earlier. Mikhail Gorbachev remained in power. The Cold War order was changing, but it hadn't yet ended. Anne went as a guest of the Soviet government, carrying out a role no British royal had performed before her. That single trip would be a major line in many public careers. In Anne's, it sits among hundreds of others. The palace's record published for her 75th birthday counted 562 overseas visits across 421 tours. It also noted that she had visited every continent. Think about what that means in human terms. Airports before dawn, flights that consume entire days, cars waiting on runways, briefings read while moving, new names, new organizations, new cultural expectations, then the return home, followed by another engagement in another town. The number is impressive. The repetition required to produce it is exhausting, yet Anne's charitable record isn't trapped in the past. In 2021, she became patron of Mercy Ships International. The organization uses hospital ships and international volunteer crews to provide free surgery, medical care, and professional training in countries where safe treatment may be difficult to access. Anne already knew the work. She had visited the hospital ship Africa Mercy in Sierra Leone in 2011. When she later visited the newly built Global Mercy in Rotterdam, she met the medical and maritime volunteers preparing to serve in Africa. Again, the pattern was familiar. She didn't attach herself only to the idea. She went aboard. She met the people doing the work. She looked at how the system functioned. This is why the phrase hardest working royal can sometimes make Anne's contribution sound smaller than it is. It turns a lifetime into a yearly score. It suggests the important thing is how many appointments she can fit into a calendar. But the real measure isn't speed, it's continuity. Save the Children didn't receive a few years of Anne's attention while the cause was fashionable. It received decades. Carers weren't given one speech. They gained an organization built to support them. Transport Charities didn't get only a royal name on a letterhead. They gained an advocate who understood that access can decide whether help reaches anyone at all. The cameras didn't need to be hostile to miss this story. They only needed to look somewhere easier. Anne's work rarely came with a feud, a fashion moment, or a sudden emotional confession. It accumulated slowly, one visit, one meeting, one return, then another year, then another decade. By September 2022, Anne had been carrying out royal duties for more than 50 years. The woman who had shaped her understanding of service had watched nearly all of it. Queen Elizabeth knew what it meant to keep going without asking whether the day felt convenient. She knew what it meant to place duty ahead of mood, and Anne had built her own life around the same discipline. Then at Balmoral, that example came to an end. The Queen died. Anne wasn't somewhere waiting to be called. She was already there, and in the days that followed, the daughter who had spent her whole life standing just outside the center would take her place beside her mother's coffin and quietly break a royal tradition that had excluded women for 86 years. Door 5. The Vigil, September 8, 2022. Balmoral Castle. Queen Elizabeth II died at 3:10 in the afternoon. Her reign had lasted 70 years. Her daughter was there. Anne later said she'd been fortunate to share the final 24 hours of her mother's life. The official death record carried another quiet detail. Princess Anne was named as the informant. The daughter who had spent more than half a century reporting for duty was the person who formally registered the death of the Queen. The royal family. 3 days later, the coffin left Balmoral. It was covered with the Royal Standard of Scotland. A wreath rested on top, made with flowers cut from the Balmoral estate. The route to Edinburgh would take around 6 hours. Through Ballater, through Aberdeen, past fields, villages, stone walls, and roads the Queen had known for decades. People stood along the route. Some bowed their heads. Some threw flowers. Some simply watched in silence. Behind the hearse traveled Anne and her husband, Sir Timothy Lawrence. There was no speech for Anne to make, no official role she needed to perform before a crowd. She was there as the Queen's only daughter, following her mother, mile after mile. When the coffin reached the Palace of Holyrood House, it was carried inside by members of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. Anne stood at the entrance. Then she lowered herself into a deep curtsy, not to a monarch entering a room, to her mother leaving one. The next day, the royal family gathered again. The coffin was taken from Holyrood House to St. Giles Cathedral. King Charles walked behind it. So did Andrew, Edward, and Anne. The 4 children of Elizabeth II followed their mother through Edinburgh. Inside the cathedral, the crown of Scotland was placed upon the coffin. A service was held. Then the doors opened to the public! Thousands came to pay their respects. But later that evening, another ceremony began, one with no speeches, no music, no applause. At around 7:40, the king and his 3 siblings entered the cathedral once more. They approached the coffin. Then they separated. Each took a position around their mother. This was the Vigil of the Princes. The tradition had entered modern royal history in 1936, when the 4 sons of King George V stood guard beside their father's coffin. It had happened again for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 2002. But every royal who had taken part before September 2022 had been a man, a son, a grandson, a prince. Not this time. Anne wore the full ceremonial uniform of the Royal Navy. She stepped into place beside her brothers. Then she lowered her head. For around 10 minutes, the Queen's 4 children stood in complete silence. Charles was no longer only her eldest son. He was the king. Andrew had lost his public role. Edward was preparing to inherit many of his father's responsibilities. But in that moment, titles offered no protection. They were 4 children standing beside their mother, and among them was the first woman ever to take part in that vigil. There was no announcement before Anne entered, no pause asking the public to appreciate the barrier being broken, no speech about equality, no attempt to turn the moment into a personal achievement. Anne simply stood where a daughter belonged. The tradition changed because excluding her would have made no sense. That may be one of the clearest descriptions of her entire life. She didn't demand entry. She made her presence impossible to question. 4 days later, Anne stood vigil again at Westminster Hall. Once more, she took her place with her brothers. Once more, she wore uniform. Once more, there was silence. Then came the funeral, the processions, the committal at Windsor, the final service inside St. George's Chapel. Anne had accompanied the coffin from the Scottish Highlands to Edinburgh, then from Scotland to London. She followed it through the capital, and she was there when her mother was laid to rest beside Prince Philip. Only after it was over did Anne release a brief public statement. She didn't center her own grief. She thanked the people who had lined the roads and shared the family's loss. Even while mourning, Anne's attention moved outward. Then public duty resumed. That was what her mother had taught her. That was what her father had modeled, and that was what Anne knew how to do. Less than 2 years later, on June 23, 2024, something happened inside the protected grounds of Gatcombe Park. The precise details remain unclear. Anne couldn't remember them. She was found with head injuries and a concussion. Horses had been nearby, and doctors said the injuries were consistent with an impact from a horse's head or legs. She was taken to Southmead Hospital in Bristol. She remained there for 5 nights. Her engagements were cancelled. A planned visit to Canada was postponed. For once, Anne had no choice but to stop, but only briefly. On July 12, less than 3 weeks after the accident, she returned to public duty. Her first engagement wasn't a palace banquet. It wasn't a state reception. It was the national championships of the Riding for the Disabled Association, an organization she'd supported for more than 5 decades. She arrived with a fading bruise near one eye. She presented awards. She spoke to volunteers. She stayed on her feet. Then she went home and continued recovering. No dramatic interview followed, no account of fear, no attempt to turn the accident into a story about personal bravery. Anne couldn't remember what had happened, so she did what she'd always done. She carried on. The royal family, the revelation, more than 20,000 official engagements. That figure is often used to explain Princess Anne, but it doesn't. A number can count appearances. It can't count the early alarms, the overnight flights, the briefing papers read in moving cars, the names remembered, the hands shaken, the grieving families met, the volunteers thanked, the events attended while something private was falling apart at home. 20,000 engagements tell us where Anne went. They don't tell us what she surrendered to keep going. She gave the crown certainty. The certainty that she would arrive, the certainty that she would be prepared, the certainty that she wouldn't turn discomfort into crisis or disappointment into revenge. When the law placed younger brothers ahead of her, she didn't make her exclusion the family's daily problem. When danger entered her car, she refused to surrender control. When royal life reached her children, she gave them space beyond it. When charity work took her into unfamiliar countries, she listened before claiming expertise. When her mother died, Anne helped carry the burden that followed. Then she returned to the calendar. This doesn't mean the crown gave Anne nothing. It gave her honors, military appointments, the title of Princess Royal, a place beside the monarch at the most important ceremonies of state. To claim she received no recognition at all would be false. But there's a difference between being decorated and being fully seen. What seems to be missing is one public moment large enough to hold the entire record. One moment that says her contribution wasn't background work. It was part of the structure holding everything upright. Perhaps the institution never created that moment because Anne never asked for it. She made service look ordinary. She made endurance look natural. She made sacrifice look like a normal entry in the diary. And when one person carries weight without complaint, everyone around them slowly forgets how heavy it is. That may be the real cost of Anne's silence. It protected the crown from her pain, but it also protected the crown from having to acknowledge it. Witness confirmation people who've worked around Anne rarely describe her in grand language. They describe movement, discipline, momentum. Dickie Arbiter, Queen Elizabeth's former press secretary, put it simply. She just gets on with it, often carrying out multiple engagements in one day. It sounds almost casual, as though getting on with it requires no emotional price. But that sentence contains the whole system. Anne arrives. Anne handles it. Anne moves to the next duty. No one needs to stop and ask what it took, because she's already left for the next appointment. New York Post. The best explanation may have come from Anne herself after Prince Philip died. She said, "It is his example of a life well lived and service freely given that I most wanted to emulate." Freely given, not traded for popularity, not exchanged for sympathy, not offered only when the work was rewarding. Given because service had value even when nobody was watching. The royal family, that's why Anne's restraint has been so easy to misunderstand. It can look cold from a distance. It can sound blunt. It can seem as though nothing reaches her. But discipline isn't the absence of feeling. Sometimes it's the decision not to make your feelings everyone else's burden. Anne doesn't appear to want a standing ovation. She has repeatedly avoided making herself the event. And that creates an uncomfortable truth. The people least likely to request recognition are often the easiest people to overlook. Not because their contribution is small, because they've trained everyone to believe they can continue without being thanked. Final image London, July 31st, 2012. Greenwich Park. The British eventing team has won Olympic silver. 5 riders step onto the podium. One of them is Zara Phillips. Not Princess Zara, not Her Royal Highness, just Zara Phillips, an athlete wearing the same Team GB uniform as everyone beside her. She has earned her place through dressage, cross-country, and show jumping. No family title could lower a fence. No royal connection could erase a penalty. The result had to be won. Waiting to present the medals is Princess Anne, president of the British Olympic Association, former Olympian, and Zara's mother. 36 years earlier, Anne had represented Britain in Montreal. Now her daughter has reached the Olympic podium in the same sport. Anne moves along the line, one athlete at a time, Then she reaches Zara. She places the silver medal around her daughter's neck. Protocol remains intact. But for a brief moment, the official roles fall away. The Olympic administrator is looking at the child she chose to raise without a title. The athlete is looking at the mother who gave her the freedom to earn an identity of her own. Zara doesn't need a crown. The medal is enough. Anne smiles. The two share the moment. Then Anne moves to the next member of the team. Because Zara isn't the only athlete on the podium, and Anne still has a job to finish. Quiet, closed Princess Anne doesn't need pity. She'd probably find it irritating. What she deserves is accuracy, not the tabloid version, not the severe woman at the edge of a photograph, not a yearly headline that counts her appointments and then forgets her again. The full story. A daughter limited by an old law who refused to let rank define her value. A mother who gave her children choices she never had. A public servant who learned the work before speaking about it. A royal who stood beside the crown without needing to stand at its center. What did Anne give? Not one grand gesture. Something harder. Constancy. And after more than half a century, perhaps the most honest thank you is simply to stop looking past her. There are more stories behind the crown. When you're ready, I'll be here. If Princess Anne's story changed the way you see her, like this video and subscribe to Behind the Crown for more untold royal stories. And don't leave yet. The next story reveals another side of the royal family most people have never seen. Click the video on your screen right now, and I'll meet you there.